Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we're going to be going over the Zero to Hero episode on the No Man's Land Explosive Trap Bladedancer. So, if you are living under a rock, I will explain it to you. Explosive Trap is an absurdly strong skill. Not only does it have ridiculous damage multipliers in its tree, it also just spews out a bajillion traps. The most meta way of currently playing Explosive Trap is to utilize it alongside the Trebuchet node that throws out an acid flask every single time you get an extra explosive trap utilizing that one node. The reason why this is so strong is because not only are you getting two explosive traps per cast, like in general, like 2 times the amount, you're also getting an acid flask. And turns out acid flask is pretty good when you get hundreds of them instead of just the measly like one or two you normally would get. Now, that's cool and all, but the biggest problem with this is acid flask has a decent mana cost. And if you're going to be spamming that many, you need minus mana cost rings. And we just don't have access to those in the early game, especially day one, like in the Zero to Hero series, right? So I have found a way to actually level as Explosive Trap that doesn't require you to have those minus mana cost rings. Now, of course, you could just play Shadow Daggers or Umble Blades or something like that, but if you wanted to play Explosive Trap all the way through, and then respec into the probably better version of this build, that's the way to go. Now, this build took a lot of trial and error in the end game, mainly just because I was trying to figure out how all the mechanics worked, because, definitely not an easy thing to do. And to explain what's going on the screen, we do have to actually take a masterclass in game mechanics. So, if you do not know, there is a node inside Shift that allows you to give your next skill after using Shift a lot of buffs. So you can give it like bleed chance, bleed duration, automatic crits, and also as well more damage. This is important as this allows Combo Rogue to function. Combo Rogue is an archetype where you build up a really big hit or a bunch of big skill hits. Like, for instance, Lethal Mirage is a good example here. Another good example is Hail Varos. Hail Varos does the same thing. But it turns out you can actually achieve the same thing with Explosive Trap. The reason why is because of No Man's Land. So what will happen is we shift, give our Explosive Trap a bajillion bleed chance and duration in effect, right? Cool. Then we cast Explosive Trap utilizing No Man's Land, which makes us throw our maximum traps every single time we throw Explosive Trap, but it adds a cooldown to it. Now, that's not all. Turns out you can also utilize a synchronized strike or whatever way you use to make shadows and throw even more explosive traps. Now, of course, each of these shadows will only throw 3 explosive traps each, but that's fine because what will happen is our main attack will throw 11 explosive traps. Then all 5 of our shadows will throw 3 each. So you end up with 26 traps. But that's not all. With all of the extra nodes inside of Explosive Trap's tree, we actually end up getting double the amount. So we end up throwing around 52 traps every single time we throw it. And all of those traps also get the buffs from Shift, which allows you to do a very large amount of damage with Explosive Trap, even though you're only throwing it every maybe 7-ish seconds, something like that. That's cool and all, but I will note one thing. I'm not entirely sure if the Shift buffs will apply to the synchronized strike like shadow ones, but I'm pretty sure they do. It's just not, I just couldn't test it in a proper way that made sense. But yeah, so the only problem though is we have an explosive trap that is a 7-second cooldown. That's not very good, like in general. Like, you can clear the entire screen with a well-placed explosive trap, but then all of a sudden you have nothing to do for 7 seconds. Well, thankfully, there's a lot we can do in the meantime while waiting for our explosive trap, which we'll figure out as we level this character. Now, if you haven't already, I would heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that is the best way of currently supporting me, and it's the best way to show me that you want more content like this on YouTube. Here we are again at the character select screen. This time we're going to be naming ourselves around a Dan to Dan reference, as of course I watched it recently. It's great, cool show. But we're going to be leveling as a Bladedancer this time. You could technically play this on a Falconer if you wanted to, but there wouldn't be that much of a reason to do so. So we're going to be playing as a Bladedancer this time. Now, of course, I played a Bladedancer last time, which is unfortunate, but it's okay. We'll play a Marksman eventually. Now, the normal meta for leveling a just any rogue in general is to utilize puncture. Puncture not only gives you access to ailments, which are really strong in the early game as base damage does not scale in the end game, but they are boosted to be able to actually deal damage in game, meaning that if you apply one ailment early on, it gives you a lot more damage than, like, let's say hitting with a weapon would give you currently. That's cool. And puncture allows you to access this much easier because not only does it give you bleed duration with all of the things that it hits with, it also gives you access to a lot of bleed chance in its tree, and it also gives you access to attack speed with the frenzy node. That's important as we don't really have that much early on, so all of these are just multiplicative modifiers to our damage. Not only that, we also get access to a lot of percent damage just by being a rogue. Now, of course, Act 1 for Rogue is pretty simple. Just puncture him to death, and we're good to go. Act 1 done. Now, Act 2 is going to be a little bit different than what you'd normally do on a rogue. Normally, you would scale into spinny umbral blades as it kind of utilizes the buffs from the puncture because it's global bleed chance, right? So that's the normal meta way of leveling, or at least in my opinion. Other people have different opinions on that, but for me, that's how I feel to be the best currently, is to just use puncture bleed into spinny umbral blades, and then eventually you could swap into shadow daggers later on when you have better skills and stuff like that. But early on, it just seems to be absurdly strong in terms of damage, because then you can use the shift stuff to give your spinny umbral blades even more damage. But this time around, we're actually not going to use umbral blades. We're going to try to swap immediately into explosive trap, which I think was overall a mistake, I think, if I were to think about it overall. So I would not suggest leveling like this. Now, here we are with explosive trap, and we immediately grab no man's land. Was that a good idea? No, it was not a good idea at all. And I realized this the moment I clicked it. But I said, screw it. We're going to struggle through it because why not? Entertainment for you guys. Do not level like this. There are much better ways of doing it. Do not do it like this, please. But we tried this way. Now, what was interesting is we tried to level as crit. The reason why is there's a node inside shift that allows your next attack to automatically crit. This means we don't have to scale crit chance at all, which means we can just scale damage. And that would work for all the explosive traps thrown after the shift, including, the synchronized strike ones and all that. That's cool, but it turns out there's a bug, which I'll be talking about later, that kind of foils my plans. Here we go. So I'm trying to utilize the combination of explosive trap with no man's land on top of decoy. Now, the auto crit with shift, it turns out, does not currently work with the decoy in general. Like if you have the triple decoy setup, the auto crit is currently not working, which sucks. And the reason why it sucks so much is because I realized, hey, we can't play crit because the idea was to utilize in succession explosive trap, then decoy, explosive trap, decoy, and then shifting in between to get the auto crit going. And that was originally going to be the plan. But turns out we can't do that if it's bugged. So I had to hard pivot into ailments. The only problem with this is decoy isn't the best ailment applying skill, but I just ran with it for the most of the campaign and most of the early game because I said, screw it, why not? Now here's our hearten. Our leveling process with this build was not comfortable at all. Do not try this at home. As you can see here, the damage is not very high, especially if you compare it to the Umbral Blade setup or just any actual good leveling setup in general. Like, it's just nowhere near as good. It's just crazy how bad this ended up being in general, mainly because I was forced to swap into an ailment setup. I think if I was able to go crit, it wouldn't be nearly as bad, but since I was forced into ailment because of the bug, I had to go through my punishment and just play the game this way for a bit. Now, something you'll see a lot in the footage is I am desperately looking for a unique. I'm currently looking for the decoy unique that reduces its cooldown significantly. So instead of having a 15-second cooldown on decoy, we could have a 6-second cooldown. This would make it so that we could use decoy for clear and then use explosive trap for single target. That's important because that would have made the decoy version function. But as you'll see later, I never ended up with the decoy relic in a functional way, mainly because of just RNG, which is important to know that if you want to get a unique in like day one of SSF or something like that, do not plan on having it until like you're in like 200-ish corruption and you're farming favor in COF, or you're also in Merchant's Guild. You should be focusing on playing builds that don't require uniques whatsoever. And then if you drop that unique, then you can like pivot into that build, but don't try to hard pivot into a build that requires a unique like I'm trying to do here, because I'm trying to salvage this monstrosity that I've accidentally created. But as you can see, we're utilizing the synchronized strikes now, and that makes our explosive trap a lot better. Now, this is where the build actually starts to show a little bit of promise. As you can see, we got the shift buffs going on. We got the synchronized strike with the shadows. We can also overlap our explosions on the twins. This is where the build doesn't look like giga garbage. And that's mainly because, as you can see, that bleed number there, that is the amount of explosive traps we're shitting out. It is that many explosive traps. Now, of course, right now we're just going with generic ailments with a focus on bleed currently, but we'll be swapping out of that eventually. Oops, look at that. Frostroot Warden dead. Now we're done with the campaign. As you can see here, this is our first monolith here. Now, the biggest problem with this build is by far the clear, mainly early on anyways. You can get very large explosive trap explosions utilizing the area nodes on its tree, and that works and all, but the problem is if you're not scaling enough cooldown, you end up with a very large, long cooldown on explosive trap. And that doesn't lead to good, solid gameplay. Now, like I said, we were supposed to have decoy set up with the decoy relic to be our clear, but whatever. But the thing is like whenever we do get to use a explosive trap, it feels great. Like just the AoE on it feels great whenever we get to actually use explosive trap. But that's like the biggest problem with this setup currently is the fact that like we're hard relying on explosive trap to clear, and it's on like a 10-second cooldown right now. Now, to give you an idea of how many explosive traps we're actually shitting out, here's an abomination, right? Watch his bleed ticks go up. So we're going to do the combo, bam, 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 throw out a bunch of explosive traps, all of a sudden, immediately at 220 bleeds, immediately. And he immediately goes to half health. That is the power of explosive trap with No Man's Land on top of the shadow stacking and on top of shift. If shift wasn't working, this would not be this way, right? You wouldn't be doing this much damage. Remember, this is one cast of explosive trap every like maybe 8 to 10 seconds. Absolutely insane amount of DPS out of explosive trap. And of course, it gets the better and better as you scale your cooldown, which is something I will be doing as I progress through the monolith system. Now we got our Rye mono here. As you can see, we're still kind of struggling, mainly because we just don't have access to that much clear because we throw out our explosive trap, kill everything on the screen, but then all of a sudden we have to wait forever for the next explosive trap. Not only that, the mana cost is pretty absurd. We managed to fix it later with some mana stacking and stuff like that and getting some mana on our gear, but early on it was rather painful. I definitely will say you could have just played like puncture plus umbral blades with a bow and still had a much better time than I'm currently having right now, as you can see in the footage. But I was just struggling through it because why not? Content. Also as well, I had nothing else better to do that day anyways. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but our Rye fight took a while, mainly because he kept moving when I would put down the explosive traps. So you have to make sure he's actually standing still for us to actually kill him properly. But when we actually get to hit the explosive traps on him, we do plenty of damage and he goes down. Finally, back to visiting our favorite penis farmer. As you can see, the damage is absurd at this point with Explosive Trap. Whenever we get to actually utilize Explosive Trap, it feels pretty good. And it would feel even better if if we had access to crit instead of going ailments. But like I said, we can't really go crit if we can't utilize decoy, because decoy is the main way of getting clear out of this build if we go crit, because the idea, of course, is you throw down decoy with the decoy relic, and it does like has 600% added damage effectiveness with a lot of more damage in its tree, and it has 3 projectiles, and it feels great. But, you know, we're forced to go ailment, like I said here. Very close call there on Lagan. Very disgusting, because our sustain isn't that good right now. Yeah, that's actually a problem early on with the build that I realized was the sustain was very intermittent, and that's not very good as a rogue, because as a rogue, you have low access to any amounts of HP, meaning that you need to be at max HP all the time. Otherwise, you're going to get one tapped randomly. So this is a problem that we actually end up fixing later on, as you will see. Now here's our dumb big daddy dragon. What's really cool is we can kind of just spew out our load and then go run away and wait for our load to come back. It does actually end up being a decent bossing playstyle for the most part early on. Later on, this doesn't work as well because of the way that the harbingers work, but early on, we can just throw down all of our explosive traps and do plenty of damage. As you can see though, our damage is lacking a little bit going into Dragon. That's mainly because we're missing a lot of things that would make this function a lot better. We're missing like bleed uniques that would make it better. We're missing good items in general. I remember, if I'm not mistaken, during this point of progression, I was streaming it. I had terrible like gear. What's like just awful gear, just completely awful gear. No percent damage on my gear, like no bleed chance on my weapons, like just really bad gear overall. Now, this is where the first respec comes in. We decided to ditch decoy and we decided to go with acid flask instead. And acid flask is pretty good. I was planning on going ignite with this build in the first place, and that's why we're going to go with acid flask, but we kind of got screwed over, as you'll see later. But essentially, we're trying to utilize the acid flask node as well. As you can see, lots and lots of acid flasks, and it just pumps up our hits to the moon. But the biggest problem is it consumes mana when it throws the acid flask, meaning that if you are not at positive mana when the explosive traps go off, you will not create acid flasks, which means that we needed much better mana sustain than I'm showing in this clip. But the damage is there, you get plenty of hits, but like I said, just very obnoxious playstyle of trying to keep up the mana. So I decided to ditch it. Now, to give you an idea of our damage scaling at this point, here's our Spirits of Fire. I did end up doing it with the Acid Flask setup, mainly because I didn't figure out what I wanted to do till later. But something that happened in between now and Empowered Monoliths was I got access to Assault the Wound, which was crazy to me because I was trying to go for a Malin's Hubris at this point because I wanted to go ignite damage because you'd use the acid flasks plus Malin Hubris and like convert all that bleed into ignite and then scale that to the moon. But turns out we can't do that when we get Assault the Wounds first, so I decided to just go bleed instead. The damage is actually pretty good at this point, mainly because the acid flasks are pretty good. As you can see, the mana costs are really obnoxious to maintain. Like I said, that's something we will fix in the future once we get rid of the acid flask setup. But like I said, we got Assault the Wound, we're swapping into bleed, we're ditching acid flask. That's just what we're going to be doing here. Now here's Heorot as well. We're doing it with acid flask as well, just trying to get them down, and we'll be making our next transition after this. Now here's some footage of the new respec. Turns out, if we are just going to go bleed with Salt the Wound, and eventually I also get a Valder's Chalice as well, which also pissed me off because that was before the Ignite Relic, because that 100% Ignite duration would have been great if we actually played Ignite. Cool, right? Whatever. So we're playing bleed now. Turns out you can actually utilize Lethal Mirage because Lethal Mirage functions exactly the same way as what we're doing with Explosive Trap because it scales off of shadows It scales off a shift, giving it more damage and stuff like that. So what we can do is we can do synchronized strike, shift, explosive trap, then synchronized strike, shift, lethal mirage, and just rotate between those two. Later on, I realized that there's a really strong way of going about this, but early on, it's just for damage, mainly for extra boss DPS and for extra clear. Then vulnerability on lethal mirage allows us to wait it out for our explosive traps, because whenever we get to actually use the explosive traps, we do a bajillion damage, mainly because we have Assault the Wind at this point, and we have Avowed Chalice at this point, which help immensely. Now, here's our first Harbinger. I'm just going to let it play the whole fight, mainly because it's only about a minute long. That is how much damage we have at this point. That is because of the fact that we have Salt the Wound, and of course, Founder Chalice. We have a good setup going. Turns out, Lethal Mirage is a good skill. Who would have thought, right? The thing is, the amount of support we require to make Lethal Mirage good is not very high. We don't need that much investment to make it good, which makes it perfect on top of this explosive trap stuff that we're doing. So they just end up working hand in hand, and it feels great because Lethal Mirage has always had a problem with clear, but it turns out when you can puke out 52 explosive traps, you can clear pretty well. And you can see here the massive amount of bleeds on the Harbinger of Fear. Also as well, the Lethal Mirage ends up making it much easier on these bosses because Lethal Mirage in general is just generically good at bossing, mainly because of this fact where you can be immune for a few seconds. Like here, I try to go immune while the Harbinger of Fear is trying to do some shenaniganry and stuff like that. Ends up being a lot better of a playstyle than the original build was going to end up being. Of course, as is tradition, we unlock COF. Now, I did not use the 80,000 favor that I had at the end of this challenge. You could have used that to get better gear than what I had in the footage, of course. So here's our first empowered mono, the new setup. It feels so much more organically better than the old version felt, mainly because we just have something to do while we are waiting for explosive trap, i.e. lethal mirage. Now, there's a lot of other cool benefits as we'll get into later, but one thing that we managed to do is there's a node inside explosive trap that gives you dust shrouds. And the mechanic is the longer it stays on the ground, the more dust shrouds we get, yada, yada, yada. What's cool about that, though, is there is a node at the top of Bladedancer that gives you like 5 health on kill or on hit of rare or unique enemy per shroud that you own. This allows us to fix that intermittent like sustain problem we had earlier. This on top of Valor's Chalice means that not only do we have a bunch of life on hit on bosses, we also have a bunch of life on kill while clearing, which means that we can stay tippy top shape when we're doing monoliths and stuff like that. That is very important as a rogue because, like I said, you don't have that much access to EHP, which means you need to focus a lot more on making sure you're topped off constantly, because imagine you're at half health and the boss hits you. You're dead probably because you're a rogue, right? So it's very important to stay topped off as a rogue, which makes those nodes a lot better for it. As is tradition, Harbinger of Chaos second. It is by far the hardest Harbinger out of all of them, not because of the Harbinger itself, but because of the arena. But thankfully, due to the ability of Explosive Trap just being pump and dump, and the same nature of Lethal Mirage being pump and dump, we end up being able to spend more than average amounts of time to just simply kind of casually kill him and not stress too hard. I've noticed that with this build, you want to stay away from him and just go in for the kill when you do get access to your skills, but it's generally better to stay away from him. That's because not only does it make it easier to dodge the like the whirlpools, like the little waves, but it also means that he does not do that void slash. That void slash is very dangerous for rogues in general early on, mainly because it just does so much fucking damage. It doesn't matter how much HP you stack, because as a rogue, you're gonna be at like 1700. I actually have more than average HP that you'd have at this point as a rogue, by the way. That's why it's so important to stay away from those void slashes, right? But we end up getting him down. Good to go. I think this was the first try as well. Thank you. And to drive home my point about power creep in last Epoch, here is an Oribus. I'm sure you guys can't guess what's going to happen next. We're totally not going to fucking instantly annihilate this fucker. As you can see, bleed stacking up, do the Lethal Mirage as well. Oh, all of a sudden he's at half HP. Oh my god, so much damage already. And this is just the first Oribus, right? And if you compare that to the Harbinger, just crazy, just crazy. Here's the third Harbinger, Harbinger of Treason. It actually does not go on for that long, mainly because with the way that I described it before, we can kind of just dip in, do damage, and dip out. I believe I also got some gear upgrades as well. My damage got exploded through the roof, so being able to just do even more damage to this fucker feels great. It just allows us to dip in, do our damage, and get out. Of course, he would go down faster if I was able to just face tank him the whole time, but better safe than sorry. No point in actually like trying to like bravado these and try to kill them as fast as possible in the early game, mainly because they're just your progression harbingers. You get to show off later on when you have actual gear to deal with bullshit like this. So this is something that I've been doing of late, where I've been pushing the Harbinger of Ash ahead of the other light Harbingers. That is because of the anti-melee mechanics that he has access to. We are effectively kind of a pseudo-melee build, considering we need to be near him to get the proper rotation going for our skills, especially because of puncture. So being near him is important. As you can see, we do plenty of damage, but our damage uptime isn't really that high because turns out he has a bunch of AoE attacks that make it really hard to dodge him. At this point, I think we're at like 60% chance to dodge, and we're also capped glancing blow, but I actually was streaming this at the time, and I got like crit multiple times in a row. Remember, I have like 30% crit avoided this, I have chance to dodge, glancing blow, and it was really annoying at the time. I can see here, Harbinger of Ash deleted. Here's our second Oribus at a higher corruption. And of course, this only takes 20 seconds this time. That just shows you how much extra damage I have at this point. But yeah, the combo of utilizing Explosive Trap and Lethal Mirage ends up being absurdly strong. Of course, requires a lot of button presses, but you know, the mechanics are there. You do plenty of damage. Now, around here is when I learned of the true purpose of Lethal Mirage. Mirage Form is a buff that gives you about like 1,000 dodge or something, or 800 dodge or something like that, and like a bunch of bleed chance. And you can get the buff by critting with Lethal Mirage. And you can crit with Lethal Mirage by utilizing Shift. So you shift with the auto crit node, then crit a bunch with Lethal Mirage, and then you have a 6-second buff that gives you a bunch of dodge chance. This, in combination with all of my other dodge from my Explosive Trap stuff and all that, means that we're around like 70% dodge at this point in the footage, which makes us feel absurdly tanky for the most part. I only die to random crits, which, by the way, I died to a lot of random crits this run. I think that this is by far one of the unluckiest Bladedancer runs I've ever had in terms of just everything involved. Not only the crits from the bosses constantly with like 2% chances. On top of that, we also had access to all of the ridiculous shenaniganry earlier with, you know, me getting Salt the Wound before getting 2 common uniques. Now here's our Harbinger of War. It's only going to take about 1 minute and 21 seconds this time around. That means that we're doing plenty of damage at this point in the game, but one thing that's interesting is I upgrade my gear very slightly after this point, but after this point, my gear is in a standstill. I am essentially Harbinger rushing. I am no longer caring about what gear I have on. I'm not caring about the quality of said gear. I am just simply trying to rush through all the Harbingers because I know how much damage I need to kill them fast enough. And at this point, we have enough damage to kill them fast enough. So I end up just rushing through a bunch of Harbingers and just getting it done without paying too much of a mind to the quality of my gear. Here's another Oribus at a higher corruption, and of course, also only takes about 20 seconds to kill. That's a good showcase of a build, being able to kill Oribus this fast, because it means that you are doing plenty of damage for the end game, especially considering that this is probably like maybe 10 to 12 hours into the character. Here's some more gameplay at a higher corruption while doing some clear. As you can see, we still struggle a little bit in terms of our AoE clear, but thankfully we can just simply sit in Lethal Mirage until our Explosive Trap is back up, and that allows us to have somewhat of a decent playstyle. Now, at this point, Would you play a better build at this point instead of playing this explosive trap nonsense? Probably. You could probably play Shadow Daggers, then swap into explosive trap. But if you just want to play explosive trap, this is good to go. Also, as well, if you want to play Lethal Mirage, it turns out the best way to play Lethal Mirage is to just simply play this setup, as it doesn't take that much extra effort. Now, you do lose access to the defensive bulwarks that is Smoke Bomb and stuff like that, and like Shuriken Shift and stuff like that. But early on, defenses don't matter as much. You only care about damage and clear, and you also don't have access to the idols and the area on your gear to make Lethal Mirage actually clear enemies. So just having this clear steroid that Explosive Trap is great. Now we're on to the Harbinger of Pride. This only takes about a minute as well. My Harbinger kills are actually pretty quick so far. That actually is what told me that, hey, I have plenty of damage. Let's keep moving on. As you can see, that no man's land interaction alongside the shift more damage is doing pretty well. Whenever I get to actually hit him with all 52 traps, he ends up just piling bleeds and bleeds and bleeds. And of course, you can rotate that with Lethal Mirage to do just absurd amounts of damage early on. Now, of course, like I said, is this playstyle the best ever? No, not really, but I was enjoying it at this point. It was very fun to just simply blow my load with a bunch of traps. Also, as well, it's nice to see how big you can get explosive trap in terms of like AoE. As you can see there, like the AoE on explosive trap is getting pretty big, so it makes the overlaps very enticing. Now here's our first clip, 300 corruption for our clear. At this point, what I am doing is I am pushing a monolith to 300 corruption. Then I'm going back to the other monoliths, farming stability at these higher corruption, so I get a higher rate of stability per mono. Then I reduce it to do the Harbinger fights. That is because it's just really convenient to be farming at a higher corruption, because not only do you get better favor, you get better experience, and you just get better drops. So overall, it's better to be at a higher corruption here, even if you're going to go back and kill the Harbingers at lower difficulties, because there's no point in killing some of the Harbingers at higher difficulties because they just have shitty loot drop tables. Like, good example here, Harbinger of Defilement does not have that good of a loot table, meaning that there's no point for me to push him at a higher corruption and try to kill him at a higher corruption, because what is he going to drop? Nothing. It doesn't matter. So we're just going to go down to a lower corruption, make it a little bit easier on ourselves. Now, this one was really annoying because I think I got like crit twice in a row and I had to restart the fight. There was just like a few problems with Riot as well. I was like sitting in AoEs that I shouldn't have been, even though I felt like I wasn't in those AoEs. Riot has this problem. I think the same thing happened to the Harbinger Defilement. Pretty much a lot of shenaniganry was going on if you're watching the stream, and I was getting tilted. And that's just because whenever I would die on the rogue, what would happen is I would be like at 2k HP, but I would take a 2100 damage hit. And at this point, since I couldn't really fix my gear, it's not like as if I get more HP. I'm a rogue at level like 80 something and like 300 corruption. I can't just wave my magic wand and fix my HP number magically. So at this point, we're just kind of shit out of luck, and we just simply have to just do better. And thankfully, with the amount of damage that we have, that makes it much easier to do so. So we just dodge mechanically and do just fine. Yeah, I remember while I was streaming the other day, I actually had more problems with the fat harbingers than I usually do than with the light harbingers, and that's just mainly because their melee attacks, they do very large amounts of physical damage, and I don't have that much physical damage mitigation, and they do really big hits that aren't easy to mitigate while you're a rogue, especially if your 70% chance to glancing blow doesn't work. If your chance to dodge doesn't work, right, you're just going to get one tapped, unfortunately. And that's just the story of rogue early on. Usually how you deal with this is just by having absurd amounts of damage or having a really nice ranged playstyle like blast rain or something like that. But I didn't really have access to that at this point because I'm playing no man's land explosive trap. But I still did pretty well. Just very tilting stream the other day, I will say. Definitely the most tilted I've been in a while, especially in terms of how much bad luck I was getting. Now here's our Harbinger of Defilement here. This one was really annoying, mainly because it would put the necrotic dot under you, and I'm a dual-wielding rogue with no dot defense, 2k HP. So I'm sure you can guess what would happen if I was to stand on that necrotic dot pool. I would take a very large amount of damage in general. And there's not really much I can do about it other than just get better at the game, son. Like, that's really how it is. Like, there, I dodged that hit, but I'm pretty sure if I got hit by that, I probably would have taken like an 80% hit easily. And that's just the problem with Rogue later on, is if you're not abusing the ward gained on Shadow setup that I was abusing the last time I played Bladedancer with the net trap build, you're just simply going to just take all this extra damage for no reason, and it just sucks. It's just how it is. But you know, that's what I get for playing an HP stacking rogue in this day and age, in this circa 2025 at this point, right? Now here's last harbinger. While this spike goes on in the background, let's discuss how I feel about the build. Does it do enough damage? Yes. It has, I think I would say S in terms of the amount of damage at this point, in terms of tiering. If I were to tier it compared to my other experiences, the damage is absurdly high, especially considering that halfway through the run, I just gave up on just gearing because I was doing that much damage. It's crazy. So cool. 2, clearing. C. I would say C. C or D. It's a little bit above F, mainly after I found the Lethal Mirage setup. If we were to play this before I got the Lethal Mirage setup, I would say F. But after the Lethal Mirage setup, we definitely bumped it up to D, to where it was tolerable. Mainly just because of the cooldown. Whenever you get to actually utilize Explosive Trap, the clear feels great, but having to wait for that absurd cooldown, really annoying, right? Cool. Survivability, F. Just HP stacking rogue with no ward scaling whatsoever, dual wielding while also not using a shield. Terrible. If I were to redo this run, I would 100% farm for the bleed shield, the Flayer's Pride from A-Bomb, and then just put that on in my second slot instead of utilizing a second sword. Because holy crap, was it annoying to die to hits that only did 5% extra of my HP every single time. I would get hit, bam, 2200 damage on the nose, right? When I have like 2199 life. Like, really absurd. So overall, great experience for the most part. Got absurdly unlucky during the whole run, and I had to remake the build like 3 times. But all that considered, great run. Now let's talk about the character in detail. So first things off, let's go over skills. So we have Explosive Trap. We go No Man's Land first. This makes it so that we throw our maximum amount of traps. This is important because we get 6 traps here, then 2 traps here, so that's 8. And then eventually you can get 1 trap here and 1 trap here on your idols, so that's 10 traps there. And eventually you can get 2 traps here, so that's 12 traps in total, which gives us about 48% more damage. Also gives us a lot of mana, but doesn't matter. Cool. Then we go over here to grab Automated Bombardment as well as Trap Sprinkler to essentially double our traps. This brings us from a low amount of traps to a very high amount of traps, and it's definitely worth the mana cost. Then we also grab Trebuchet. This is mainly for clear purposes. This actually reduces your single target in a lot of situations when you're doing like bosses in the middle of trash and stuff like that. But for clear, it is unparalleled. Being able to just throw a bunch of explosive traps at random enemies makes it feel way better when you throw it in the middle of the pack. I grab 1 point in Subtle Sabotage, mainly to give me a little bit of an edge in terms of mana cost, because it was getting kind of absurd there in the late game, and the 10% less damage wasn't that big of a deal considering we dealt so much damage. Then we grab 4 points into Tinker's Design. Mainly, we want as much AoE as humanly possible, and that trigger AoE makes it feel a lot better. Then we grab Prepared Demolition on top of Gadgeteer, mainly to give us a lot of more damage in general, trying to go for a way where we just throw out our bombs and then wait for them to explode, and they do it in a big AoE, and these nodes are for that. Then we also grab Smoke Traps for the dust drop per second. We have a utility setup on Puncture, mainly bleed chance, attack speed, mana. That's really all it is on Puncture. Just as much bleed chance as possible. Lethal Mirage. This is a stereotypical Lethal Mirage setup, mainly the shadow stacking thing to get a bunch of more damage per shadow. Also as well, more Mirages over here. Then eventually Rending Darkness for the bleed chance and dodge rating buff here and the duration per crit chance strike, which we enable utilizing critical opening, just giving us a very large amount of dodge chance, getting us to like 70% dodge chance very easily. And of course, for Synchronized Strike here, just Dark Allies to get 4 shadows, then the +1 shadow from our shift, giving us 5 extra casts of Explosive Trap, which is 15 extra traps, lots of extra damage, including foreshadowing, which will apply to the Explosive Traps as well, and everything else is just utility. Then, of course, shift here, mainly just the bleed nodes here and here, just lots of extra damage. Get the crit, always crit, mainly for the Lethal Mirage to make it so that we get the buff on the dodge rating buff. Then the more damage over here, just lots and lots of more damage. Then we grab the one last shadow, so we get 5 shadows instead of 4 when we do our combo. And that's pretty much it for our skills. Now, let's talk about our passives that are important. Passives that are important, just mainly just the usual stuff you grab. The less damage while moving, the mana gained when you use a skill, easy. Falconer, we actually go all the way up to blast radius for the area of effect. This makes our AoE feel a lot better while clearing, and it also improves our overlaps on single target. Definitely not necessary, but eventually it feels really good to have, and it lets us grab all the nice rogue nodes like the HP, the endurance threshold, and stuff like that. Also as well, the increased dodge rating and mana regen. Pretty much good there. Then Bladedancer here, just all the damage you can get, all the flat HP you can get, all of the glancing blow as well to help us glancing blow clap with dust shrouds. We actually go for perfection as well, as we end up just spamming puncture on enemies constantly, giving us a lot of extra dodge and flat armor, allowing us to not get one tapped constantly. Of course, eventually Cloaked Reaper, eventually 5 out of 5 on this, then 1 point to Shadow Master to get the 5th Shadow. And eventually we would fill out Death's Door to get the less damage taken while at low life. And that's pretty much it for the passive tree. Let's go over gearing. So for mandatory uniques, I would say eventually Salt the Wound. You eventually want this. Right now, it's not important, but like eventually you want it. Literally almost doubles your single target. Cool. Boundary Shells here, same thing. Gives you a lot of bleed duration, lots of damage, less of leech, lots of life gain on kill. Very good. Can't go wrong with it. Then for a helmet here, we actually have a Blood Visage base alongside with decent stats on it. Just HP, dexterity, and eventually you want like bleed chance per sword with that. Amulet here, area, frailty, HP, good enough. Eventually you'd want double HP on your amulet, want as much HP as possible with rogue. Then weapon here, the Gossa Scimitar with mana regen and bleed on hit and fizz pen. Perfect weapon to have early on. Then of course katanas, the things that make Salt the Wound really good, because crit multi up the wazoo, physical damage percentage, and eventually you're supposed to have bleed chance, but we didn't have it there. Ring here, opal rings are very strong as they can give us a lot of cooldown recovery speed, making our explosive trap, not Pepega. A 9% opal ring will actually reduce our cooldown by like 0.5 seconds currently, so having opal ring is pretty good. Damage over time, eventually you'd want probably dexterity or something, crit avoid, HP, then resistance, cool, good to go. Other ring here, mana regen to help us sustain our mana because we are consuming a lot. Viz damage, res, HP, pretty good, all things considered. Belt here, we just went with something with as much HP as possible. Our boots, lots of cooldown recovery speed. You want at least one exalted cooldown recovery speed roll just to make our cooldown on our explosive trap feel much better. Then, of course, movement speed eventually, HP, stuff like that. Then, same thing with Outer Chalice. Here, I'm running fizz damage over time idols, but eventually you can get +1 max trap, which will add more traps to be thrown. And, of course, fizz damage over time. Increase area with throwing area skills is pretty good, too, as not only does it increase your overlaps, it also makes your clear feel better. And that's pretty much it for all of this. And that's pretty much it for the character. So, with all that being said, this has been Dread. Off to go do something else. Bye.